Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 221, and I am the show's host, Kyle. On today's show, I'm going to be discussing potential peace talks between the United States and the Taliban. The Afghan war is America's longest war. It's been dragging on for 17 years now, and most of that has been the United States trying to install a government, fight a counterinsurgency, a drug war, and also carry out counterterrorism efforts that seemingly have only increased the problem for the United States pretty much post-2002. So I'm going to get into that and how the United States could maybe potentially here get out of Afghanistan and do an absolutely great thing. If you want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. And of course, at the Libertarian Institute, you could also find my daily news roundup. And of course, thank you to Scott Horton and the rest of the guys at the Libertarian Institute who allow me to post my work there. It's helped me to get out there to more people, and that combined with all my wonderful listeners sharing the show has been extremely helpful. So let's get into the potential good news here. And that is, I think I mentioned this probably on Friday's show, that would have been 219, that Mike Pompeo had visited Kabul in a unannounced visit, a surprise visit. Now, the surprise visits are always portrayed as kind of America's superiority over the Afghans and our heightened abilities allow us to kind of come in on these surprise visits. But in reality, this is something that Scott Horton and Jason Ditz talked about on a recent episode of the Scott Horton Show, which of course I'll link to in the show notes. You can also find it at the libertarianinstitute.org. How this is because they can announce the visit because Afghanistan isn't that secure of a country. Even going and visiting Kabul, there have been major suicide attacks in that city that have resulted in a lot of people dying. And so I don't think you could say there's really safe areas of Afghanistan right now where you could have a planned visit by a high profile U.S. official like the Secretary of State or the President or something like that. Now, during Pompeo's visit, he did signal that the U.S. was willing to engage in talks, or I guess consent to peace talks in Afghanistan. To understand kind of the position here, for a long time, I think, the United States position was that we were going to come in and build a state. And this was kind of, I believe, Stanley McChrystal's government in a box. He would have been commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan probably in 2009, 2010 during the early years of the Obama administration. And we've tried to fight a counterinsurgency and counterterrorism efforts. The general goals of the war are pretty vague. Sometimes it's to increase the rights of women in Afghanistan. Sometimes it's to fight a drug war there. Sometimes it's a counterterrorism effort. Sometimes it's to defeat the Taliban. But the U.S. has long maintained that they weren't going to engage in talks with the Taliban. And the Taliban have long said that, they're not going to engage in talks with the Afghan government. I think the Taliban's refusal to have talks with the Afghan government, I'm sure it comes from a couple of reasons. The first is just like the situation on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un could shake hands and they could sign all these agreements, but the Americans don't honor them. It's really meaningless. I think the North Koreans aren't necessarily afraid of the South Koreans coming and invading their country, unless, of course, they had the American backing and likely American encouragement. Same thing with the Taliban. They can make an agreement with the Afghan government, but the United States looks the other way. A new president takes office, and as we've seen with the Iran agreement, that doesn't mean that he'll honor the agreements of his predecessor. It seems likely that the Taliban would have a hard time negotiating with the U.S. or with the Afghan government for these reasons. They've also maintained that the central government in Kabul is an illegitimate government, and that they're not going to negotiate with a group of people who they probably see as, usurp their throne, and also feel that negotiating with them would mean making concessions that recognize them as kind of the rightful government of Afghanistan. And from the peace offers that we've seen recently from the Afghan government to the Taliban, it certainly seems like those negotiations would result in the Taliban recognizing the authority and the legitimacy of the central government of Kabul. Also, if you go back to probably Friday's episode of the show, 219 of Foreign Policy Focus, you'll hear me talking about the Pompeo visit a little bit. And I really didn't take his offer to talk with the Afghans all that seriously, and his encouragement of talks, just because we've seen this before from a Secretary of State. Of course, Rex Tillerson said on several occasions the United States was willing to engage in talks with North Korea without North Korea denuclearizing first. And then Trump would hop on Twitter and say, no, that's absolutely not the case. And then later, Trump ends up talking to North Koreans without North Korea denuclearizing first. So, we see that the word of the Secretary of State may not be the actual policy of the United States, or I guess Donald Trump at that time. So it does seem that we maybe had a little bit of confirmation that this is the policy now, as Commander of U.S. Forces of Afghanistan, General Nicholson, actually said that the United States is willing to engage in direct talks with the Taliban. Now, it may come out later that the United States has some poison pills. We may engage in talks with the Taliban if they disarm first, if they reduce opium production in their territory of the country, or made some other kind of concessions that simply the Taliban wouldn't make. Maybe it would have something to do with giving up their strict interpretation of Islamic law. Of course, at the same time, the United States would be selling millions or billions of dollars worth of weapons to the Saudis. But I think the Nicholas statement does seem to me to suggest that, that this is the official policy of the United States and that we are willing to at least sit down and talk. Hopefully, we see some positive things net from this. Maybe the Taliban are willing to make actual concessions and make some sort of agreement. Maybe they're not willing to, and they're going to go back on whatever they say. But give the potential for diplomacy to work. As I said, we've been fighting this war for 17 years, and there's never been a real ceasefire or agreement with the Taliban. There was a 3-day ceasefire recently during the Afghan holy month. But kind of unfortunately, even then you have the Islamic State affiliate in Afghanistan, which is the Islamic State Khorasan group, mainly comprised of Tariqi Taliban, who are Pakistani refugees from Obama's drone war. And then they fled into Afghanistan from Pakistan and created a group and called it Islamic State K. And so even then, they were kind of able to wreck the ceasefire. Not in that the Afghan army started shooting at the Taliban, but it certainly meant that there really wasn't peace, tranquility, and no bombs going off in Afghanistan. From my perspective, the ideal policy here would just be for the Americans to say, hey, we're leaving in 60 days or 90 days, and this is the time it's going to take us to logistically figure out how to get all of our equipment out of this country to make sure that no local groups or thugs end up with a bomb or some other kind of military weapon, and make sure we clean up our messes and whatever. We don't want to pollute the area too bad. But for the United States to exit Afghanistan relatively quickly. However, more likely than not, if that war is to actually end, I think there's probably going to be some kind of agreement between the United States, Afghan government, and the Taliban first. Now, I'm really not sure what kind of negotiations could actually happen here and what the Taliban would demand and what the United States and the Afghan government will be willing to give. It seems from past proposals and recent proposals from the Afghan government to the Taliban, they're maybe looking at some sort of FARC-style resolution to this conflict where the Taliban agree to give up arms and end their insurgency in exchange for political recognition and political power in the country. On Scott Horton's episode with Jason Ditz, he suggested that a situation where the Taliban actually looked to basically have somewhat of an independent Kurdistan type of state, like what, say, the Iraqi Kurds had during the height of the ISIS occupation of Afghanistan or of Iraq, where they were essentially kind of an autonomous state that were allowed to do more or less what they wanted, but weren't actually their own nation, not upset the neighbors. And so maybe a situation like this for the Taliban would end up working out and create the best situation for everyone. Now, the interesting thing that we have coming up in Afghanistan that could really shake things up and possibly undermine or expedite or lead to more productive talks, and that is a election that's supposed to happen this fall. Now, pretty much as soon as the election news was announced and they started going out to enroll people, register them to vote, those sites became targets for the Taliban and for the ISIS-K. There's also the issue that not all people who live in Afghanistan see themselves as Afghans. And so when they were, having the voter registration cards, there was actually people protesting having Afghan on the card. There's other issues, and that is that, there's not just two factions in Afghanistan, and I'm not sure how cohesive of a unit the Taliban are. So let's say, for example, the United States comes to an agreement with whatever Taliban leadership they decide to negotiate with, but some other warlord is claiming that he's the Taliban from a different area of Afghanistan, says, I don't like that agreement. It kind of, cuts off my area or limits what I want to do, and allows concessions for you. So he continues to fight the insurgency under the name the Taliban. And then the U.S. press report, look, the Taliban aren't living up to the agreement. And then this means that the United States doesn't have an honest partner to negotiate within Afghanistan, and we just, revamp up the war there. So I do think that the factions on the Taliban side can make any kind of peace talks difficult. It will probably make, the election more complex. But there's also a lot of factions within the Afghan government or the Northern Alliance. One example of this is General Dostum, who is just a career warlord and a brutal and disgusting human being. But I think he largely controls the Uzbek population of Afghanistan, seen as one of their leaders. Recent protesting in Afghanistan has them demanding that the Afghan government allow General Dostum to re-enter the country. He's currently in exile. I believe he either ordered or actually did himself sodomized an elderly man with the barrel of a rifle. And so he's kind of in some trouble in Afghanistan, so he's living abroad right now, but they want him to come back and represent them and I guess, to be their figure in the country. And, they're saying that if he isn't allowed back, and then there's also a police sheriff that they want released from jail, then they're going to boycott the upcoming elections and just form their own autonomous state. In some respects, maybe this is what needs to happen in Afghanistan. I'm reading Aaron Margulies' book right now. It's titled War at the Top of the World, and I'm about a third of the way through. Very excellent, and recommend all of that. You read it. But Aaron points out in that book how the Soviet war in Afghanistan in the 80s fundamentally changed Afghanistan, and kind of what the country was, the complexion of it, who was there, how they related to each other was imploded. Obviously the Soviets tried to do things that the Americans are trying. They try to bring factions together, they try to tear other factions apart, they support building up one area of the country and at expense of another, and this creates a situation where the country you have is no longer the same country. I mean, 2 million people died in that war, so that's, I believe, quite a few more than the number of people that have died in the U.S. war on Afghanistan, but all the same, the complexion of the country is probably going to be fundamentally changed from the U.S. 7-year war against Afghanistan, 17-year, and really, who knows how many years the United States will continue to bomb Afghanistan, even if the U.S. troops end up leaving that country. And so it may be that, Afghanistan as a country won't exist anymore, and the Uzbeks will all have their autonomous area, and the Tajiks will have the Hazaras will have theirs, and the Taliban or the Pashtuns will have their area. But I think these are the challenges that we're going to see if the United States kind of tries to take the traditional path in finding a resolution through the war by a peace treaty. Now, if we just leave tomorrow, we don't have to deal with any of this. And like I said, if you give 90 days, that will allow, hopefully, people to get on the right sides of the right areas. That way you don't have, maybe trade certain areas ahead of time, allow all the Afghan troops that are in, let's say, Kandahar City or Lashkar leave because they know that area will be overrun by the Taliban. And maybe in exchange, the Taliban will, make agreements to withdraw from some areas that are more on the frontier of their territory. But if you look at just all the different factions, I think any kind of deal like that would be preferable, just because I think it would allow for the thing to actually come to a conclusion, where if you try to negotiate between all these different parties, it's going to be nearly impossible, especially since the United States will probably have some ridiculous demands that had to be met, and will probably be mutually exclusive of each other. And so, they could just kill the deal outright if we try a deal that way. The U.S. politicians, that is. Just some other interesting notes on what's going on in Afghanistan. We had a suicide bomber killing 5 people near the American University in Kabul. I believe this one was claimed by the Islamic State Khorasan. The United States carried out probably 2 or 3 weeks ago a pretty big push in the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan. And this is the province where the ISIS-K guys most strongly set up and where they control the most territory. And so then the United States and the Afghan government launched a big offensive into this area and claimed to have killed, I believe, about 160 of the ISIS-K fighters, and really flush them out of that area. Now, I thought it was interesting that the U.S. would go on a big offensive against ISIS-K in the area, and I'm not sure, I don't want to say that it's going to be effective and that the United States officials are right when they say that they chased them out of the area. But at the same time, if you look at the situation here where Donald Trump is pushing for another review of the policy in Afghanistan, and the fact that they really haven't had a single victory since they implemented Trump's plan August of last year, this is maybe the win that they're pushing for, trying to have to extend the war in Afghanistan. And so for this reason, I think it's going to be very important to understand that ISIS-K is a group that fled Pakistan from Obama's drone war. And that while they've set up and taken territory in Afghanistan, it's just more result of our meddling in the Middle East. And so it's really not a victory to have chased them out of Afghanistan, if we even did, and the probability that they're just going to come back. If you look at what's happened in Afghanistan, in 2002, we had the Taliban defeated. They surrendered, they left Afghanistan, they no longer have power, and yet we continue to stay and occupy the country. And they've come back as an insurgency and now control the most territory that they have since 9/11, and just goes to show the United States can't maintain control over areas of Afghanistan. And this likely will include the Nangarhar province. There has been some heavy fighting going on in Afghanistan. Hopefully, we move back towards the ceasefire type of deals, but right now we have about 80 people killed in heavy fighting, and this was probably the end of last week. Now, the last thing to note is that the Afghan government's going to look to have another ceasefire sometime in August with the Taliban. The Taliban aren't committing to it yet, but hopefully we see that, they're willing to do so when the time comes. And maybe this ceasefire will either include ISIS or ISIS will agree to it, just so that the people of Afghanistan could have a few days for the first time in 17 years or something where they're not worried about being blown up. And just to reiterate, the reason this is so terrible is that, of course, we've been there for 17 years, 2,500 dead Americans, 2 just last week, and I'm sure that number, it's only going to go up. Well, it only can go up, but it's going to keep going up if we stay there. And, we've wasted hundreds of billions of dollars in that country, killed hundreds of thousands of Afghans. There's absolutely no reason for any of it at this point. Other stuff I wanted to talk about. I've discussed in the past, there was a U.S. citizen that I said was captured fighting for ISIS. Now that fact is in dispute, and so I probably had to go back and correct that in the archives at immersionnews.com. But it looks like that he was captured in ISIS territory, but claims he was fleeing to U.S. lines. Now, there's a lot of dispute if this guy was actually an ISIS fighter. He, I think, is saying that he was trying to do some aid work in the country or just to help the people there. It looks like the U.S. government plan is to release him, and they would like to release him in Syria. The ACLU is objecting to that, saying that it's too dangerous and it's going to get him killed. And I guess that, this is how he got captured the first time. And they're asking him to drop him in Iraq, actually, where he could get a passport and I guess, make his way back to the United States or Saudi Arabia because he's a Saudi U.S. citizen. A U.S. airstrike in Syria killed 8 civilians. This just adds to the massive death toll of the U.S. war across the Middle East. Israel bombed a Syrian army airbase that's outside of Aleppo. Of course, the Syrian army continues to take territory along the border of Syria, Lebanon, and the Golan Heights in Jordan, down there in southwestern Syria. This is, of course, very upsetting to the Israelis who don't want the Syrian government there. And as The Intercept revealed, Israel was looking at creating a larger buffer zone for themselves in Syria, basically either controlling the rebel groups that control the area immediately outside of the Golan Heights, or not have the Assad government at least be the controlling force there, but it looks like Assad's going to retake all that territory, so the Israel plan isn't working out, and they're protesting and throwing a hissy fit by bombing Syrian army positions, either in southern Syria there or in more northern Syria around Aleppo. I saw Syrian state media said that nobody died in the attack, but I also saw a report that said there was something along the lines of 20 casualties. One of the more interesting stories that I've read this week is that a UAE prince fled to Qatar and then had a talk with the New York Times. It seems that the prince, I don't know if he's looking to defect to Qatar, but it does seem that he's seeking asylum there. Of course, Qatar and the UAE right now don't have diplomatic relations after last May of 2017. there was a split between Qatar and the rest of the GCC countries. This led to Saudi Arabia cutting diplomatic relations, not having any flights with the Qataris. At one point, they were trying to make all the Qataris living in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates go back to Qatar. Even now, apparently, they're taking bids in Saudi Arabia on turning Qatar from a peninsula into an island, as absolutely insane as that sounds. Now, in his interview, the talk he gave with the New York Times, he says he is the prince, the second son to one of the royal families, ruling royal families of the Emirates. There's 7. The strongest family, or the one that I guess holds the most power, I believe is the Dubai family. And they're the ones who apparently unilaterally pushed the UAE to get involved in the Yemeni civil war. The prince from this faction says that while, that's the faction of the Emirates that's pushing for it, it's people from his territory that are the ones doing the dying in Yemen, and that's one of the reasons he defected. He also claims that the Emirates intelligence service pushed him to funnel money to foreign countries and different people. One of the countries listed was Syria. I'm very interested to see who the money was going to. Maybe here we could have a paper trail or some evidence of, U.S. and U.S. allies support for the Al-Qaeda ISIS insurgency in Syria. Now, the UAE also has a string, this is unrelated to the Prince story. The UAE has a string of torture prisons in Yemen that I've talked about in past on the show. It now looks like after the AP and a few other sources have covered that, they're now shutting down those torture prisons. So when I talk about the reason that it's so important journalists write about it is for this reason. It finally got exposed. People finally started paying attention in Yemen. And now the UAE is at least trying to, they've released a bunch of people from those prisons. They're allowing some of those prisoners to leave. And this is a great thing. Hopefully they're just not making it more covert though, and, going to continue to add the prisons. Although I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to operate 1 or 2, even though it seems they're shutting them down and releasing prisoners. In the U.S., we have a judge ruling that the FISA, our FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, I believe Judicial Watch put together, but it may have been a different group, to get CIA documents on the Yemeni raid at the start of the Trump administration. Of course, this is the one where Anwar al-Awlaki's 8-year-old daughter, American citizen, got shot in the neck and slowly bled out in her grandmother's arms. And hopefully, we get some information on the decision making, what they were looking for there, and, just more information on that raid that, again, resulted in the death of a U.S. citizen. Last note, I saw a UNICEF report that said a child is dying every 10 minutes in Yemen of a preventable cause. Of course, a big cause that's absolutely preventable is the United States support for Saudi Arabia's war against the people of Yemen. And, if we end that, then we could cause a lot less Yemeni children to not die. In some good news, it seems that the Eritrea and Ethiopian push towards normalization of relations and peace is continuing to steam ahead. We have the presidents of the two countries meeting in Ethiopia, where the Eritreans reopened their embassy that was closed down years before. I've been a little bit skeptical of this just because it seems like there's such consensus from the mainstream media that this is a great thing and that the new ruler of Ethiopia is a true reformist and really wants to make his country and region a better place. Typically when this happens, the results may not be quite as nice as the media portrays them to be, but it also seems that this is a situation where there's really not great powers getting involved. Everybody's distracted with other stuff. Libya is a catastrophe. Syria is a catastrophe. We have potential North Korean denuclearization. We have the very complex situation between the United States and Iran that's causing a lot of people to pay attention. Of course, right on the other side of the Red Sea, Yemen is on fire and bleeding. And then the talks between Trump and Putin, maybe this is just getting lost in the shuffle. And we're going to see that again, as long as big powers and outside factors don't get involved, maybe things could work out peacefully between these two countries that had a history of hostility. Last thing I want to talk about is an interesting article that I found in Teen Vogue, of all places, on the United States police forces' relationship with the Israeli Defense Forces. The IDF, as I've talked about on this show, commits terrible crimes against the Palestinian people, but they also have U.S. police chiefs that go over and train with them. One of those police chiefs happened to be the St. Louis police chief, who of course responded by, imposing curfews and using tear gas against protesters following the Mike Brown, the fatal Mike Brown shooting there in Ferguson. And so for those of you who think, this doesn't sound like a big deal, remember the IDF are the ones that are currently shooting the people of Gaza who are going out and protesting the fact that the Israelis put them in an open air prison and have killed hundreds of innocent protesters. One of those, really wasn't a protester, it was a medic at the site. And there's a Mondo Weiss article that I'll link to in the show notes page, and of course you can find it on immersionnews.com as well. And in that article it explains that they found that it looks like the killing of that 20-year-old female medic in Gaza on the Great Return March protest day was targeted at her. That she was an innocent protester standing among a group of other medics, potentially with her hands in the air, was shot 25 meters away from the fence by a sniper who was aiming at her. An execution, a murder. And so if these are who our police are being trained by, that's a very, very scary thought. All right, and with that note, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. I hope you all enjoy it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com, on Twitter at KYAAALE, Facebook Libertarian Union, and then check out the Patreon page if you want to donate to the show. Patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Thanks, everyone.